Forget everything you think you know about civilization, because what happened next defies logic, spat in the face of geography, and unleashed a level of ritualistic ambition that would eventually drown an entire continent in its own blood. Can you believe that the most powerful empire the New World had ever seen, an empire of gold, feathered helmets, and absolute terror, was built on a pile of rotting mud? This is not just history. This is the prophecy fulfilled, the cosmic debt paid in rivers of life force, the story of people who didn't just conquer their neighbors, they conquered the very concept of fear itself. We are diving into the abyss, where reality bends, where gods demanded hearts, and where warriors transformed into celestial beasts. For centuries, the Mexica people, the future Aztecs, were nothing. They were vagabonds, nomadic refuge, scorned refugees staggering out of the mythical northern land called Aztlan, the place of the white heron. They were running, chased by enemies, despised by every settled tribe who watched these frantic, dust-covered people arrive with nothing but a desperate, bone-deep prophecy. This was a prophecy whispered by their patron god, the terrifying Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and the sun. Huitzilopochtli, a deity whose demands were always absolute, promised them a home. Not a comfortable valley, not a fertile riverbank, but a sign so bizarre, so impossible, that only the truly desperate would follow it. They were told to look for an eagle, an enormous, magnificent eagle perched upon a nopal cactus. And beneath that eagle, clutched in its vicious talons, would be a serpent, a symbol of the earth and the underworld, being devoured. This sign, Huitzilopochtli declared, would mark the precise center of the universe, the axis mundi, the place where the sun would rise forever, sustained by their future conquest. They were pushed, ridiculed, and ultimately driven to the absolute worst possible place on the map, the great, unforgiving lake of Texcoco. Imagine this nightmare landscape. It wasn't clean water, it was a desolate swamp, a shimmering maze of brackish water and treacherous mudflats, where nothing grew well, where foundations sank instantly, and where the air was thick with the stench of decay. It was a place where no sane civilization would ever attempt to establish a capital. It was a watery grave waiting to happen. This was the catastrophic moment. The moment the Mexica, tired, starving, and surrounded by hostile enemies who wanted them dead, realized they had nowhere left to run. They stood at the edge of the water, looking at the tiny, unstable island in the reeds, a land so utterly worthless that their enemies hadn't even bothered to claim it. And then, the impossible happened. The moment burned into their collective memory, transforming fear into fanatical zealotry. They spotted it. On that desolate, muddy outcrop, among the reeds and the biting insects, stood the colossal eagle, its dark feathers catching the sharp, unforgiving, high-altitude sun. It was perched exactly where the prophecy declared, upon a tenacious nopal cactus, its roots gripping the unforgiving rock. And in its razor-sharp beak, the struggling, twisting serpent. The sign was real. The prophecy had landed in the absolute center of their impossible misery. This wasn't just finding a home. This was a cosmic mandate to build their destiny on the very spot that nature had rejected. This island, this treacherous bog, was now the chosen site for the glorious, blood-soaked capital of the universe, Tenochtitlan. But how do you build a city of stone and splendor on sinking mud? How do you feed a burgeoning population when the only harvest is waterlogged reeds? The answer was ingenuity driven by desperation and a relentless, terrifying will to dominate the natural world. They had to become masters of water. They began the most audacious engineering project the New World had ever conceived. They started driving thousands upon thousands of immense wooden pilings deep into the unstable lakebed, creating artificial foundations, a network of underwater stilts designed to fight the relentless pull of the swamp. They hauled earth, rock, and rubble from the mainland, slowly raising the ground level, inch by terrifying inch. They built chinampas, the infamous floating gardens. These were intricate agricultural fields constructed from layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and lake sediment, held in place by woven fences anchored to the lake floor. These floating farms were absolute marvels of sustainable agriculture. Because they were constantly irrigated by the lake water and constantly fertilized by the rich sludge, they produced multiple harvests every single year. Where their neighbors farmed based on the seasons, the Mexica farmed perpetually. This sudden, radical burst of productivity gave them the essential advantage. While everyone else saw a watery graveyard, the Mexica saw an endless, fertile opportunity. They transformed the most disadvantageous piece of real estate into an agricultural engine that could feed hundreds of thousands. The island grew. The population exploded. And the city that rose from the water was unlike anything seen before. Imagine Venice, but built not for canals, but for ritualistic power and cosmic engineering. Causeways were built, connecting the island to the mainland, acting as critical defensive choke points. Towering temples of white and red stone began to climb toward the sky, dedicated to the gods of creation and the gods of war. The most important structure, the beating heart of the empire, was the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. This massive double pyramid was the physical manifestation of their dualistic universe. One side, dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, symbolized fertility and the life-giving harvest from the chinampas. The other side, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, symbolized the sun, war, and the incessant, terrifying demands for cosmic sustenance. It was the place where the cosmic bargain was sealed in warm, flowing blood. This was the moment the despised refugees became the masters of the swamp. They had not just built a city, they had built a fortress of destiny, surrounded by water, perfectly defended, and underpinned by an agricultural miracle. The Mexica had arrived, and the rest of the Valley of Mexico, the established city-states that had mocked them for decades, suddenly realized they had allowed a terrifying, world-devouring predator to build its nest right in the center of their lands. The age of the Aztec Empire was about to explode into existence, and the world would never be the same. The moment the first mud-caked foundation stone was set, the Mexica understood the terrifying, impossible price of their prophecy. They had been given a sign of divine favor, yes, but that sign demanded nothing less than the absolute, total, unending conquest of nature itself, day after grueling day, for centuries to come. Lake Texcoco was not a placid mirror reflecting the glory of Huitzilopochtli. It was a hungry, churning beast, demanding tribute in collapsed walls, sudden floods, and the constant, back-breaking labor of men who refused to be drowned. Their city, Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus, was founded on faith and fear. A floating island of desperation surrounded by powerful, cynical kingdoms, who viewed these ragged newcomers as little more than landless, squabbling barbarians, ripe for exploitation. The air itself was thick with the smell of death, stagnant water, and the metallic tang of newly laid foundation mud. A constant reminder that failure meant being swallowed whole by the very place their God had chosen for them. Survival was not a hope. It was a war waged against the environment itself. But the Mexica were not just barbarians. They were engineers forged in the crucible of absolute, desperate necessity. To feed their growing population, they looked at the unusable swamp and, defying all logic, decided to invent land. This miraculous technology, the chinampas, or floating gardens, became their lifeline. Massive, rectangular fields woven from reeds, dredged lake mud, and decaying vegetation, anchored firmly to the shallow lake bed by the tenacious roots of fast-growing trees. Suddenly, the unusable, salty swamp became the most intensely fertile ground in all of Mesoamerica, a hydraulic miracle yielding up to 7 staggering harvests a year, powering their impossible population boom and turning them into an economic force. This was how they conquered hunger, but they still needed to conquer isolation. To connect this vulnerable, fertile heart to the mainland, they began the arduous, multi-generational construction of the Great Calzadas, massive earthen causeways that sliced through the lake like the spine of a sleeping stone dragon. These causeways were not just roads, they were life support. Built wide enough for marching armies, massive caravans, and the flow of tributary goods, punctuated by strategic wooden drawbridges that could be pulled up in an instant, transforming their nascent city into an impenetrable defensive fortress. They were servants to the mighty Teponic Empire of Azcapotzalco, ruled by the iron-fisted lord Tezozomoc. The Mexica were useful, but ultimately disposable. Dogs of war, given permission to exist only as long as they remained profitable. The Mexica were forced to pay crippling tributes: labor, textiles, precious goods, and, most crucially, their fiercely trained young men who were deployed as ruthless shock troops in Azcapotzalco's relentless campaigns against rival cities like Culhuacan and Texcoco. This servitude, however humiliating and grinding, was a deadly apprenticeship. The Mexica learned not only how to fight regional warfare, but how to manage a vast, sprawling empire, cataloging the political weaknesses and military vulnerabilities of every potential rival. They were the sword arm of the Tepanek machine, sharpening their own blades with the blood of their overlord's enemies, patiently waiting for the precise, inevitable moment to turn that blade upon the hand that fed them. To elevate themselves from mere mercenaries to legitimate players on the political stage, they needed more than just chinampas and causeways. They required a divine mandate and royal, established blood. Their first true Tlatoani, or supreme speaker, was Acamapishtli, installed around 1375 CE. This was not a random choice by the Mexica elders. He was strategically married to a daughter of the ruling line of Culhuacan, effectively forging a vital link, however temporary, to the revered, mythical lineage of the ancient Toltecs, the golden civilization whose powerful legacy everyone in the valley sought to emulate. His son and successor, Huitzilihuitl, continued this lethal diplomatic strategy, maneuvering to marry the daughter of the great Tepanek ruler Tezozomoc himself, intertwining his family's future with that of their masters. With every strategic bride, the Mexica meticulously wove themselves deeper into the political tapestry of the valley, transforming the image of the mud-dwelling barbarian into one of an ambitious, necessary, and dangerously well-connected relative. They were no longer just building a city in the swamp. They were building a bloodline that demanded respect, or else. Their ambition was now coated in the veneer of ancient nobility and political necessity. For nearly 50 years, the old Tepanek lord Tezozomoc had been the unbreakable, absolute center of the valley, the immovable obstacle to Mexica independence. He was the anchor of the known world. The Mexica, now led by their new, fiercely independent Tlatoani, the ruthless and brilliant Itzcoatl, found themselves trapped between the warring Tepanek heirs, facing a terrifying proposition: submit to a new, possibly harsher master, or seize the moment, facing total annihilation in the process. The son who eventually seized power in Azcapotzalco, Maxtla, immediately recognized the inherent, terrible danger posed by the fiercely independent young Mexica state on the lake. He saw them not as useful allies, but as a dagger pointed directly at his throat, ready to strike. Maxtla intended to rip that dagger out. He immediately increased the tribute demands to crushing levels, implemented crippling taxes, and, most lethally, blockaded Tenochtitlan, threatening to starve the proud island city back into the swamp from whence it came. The Mexica were pushed to the absolute breaking point. The moment for passive obedience was over. It was time for the true bloody history of the Jaguar Knights to begin. The vision of the eagle and the serpent had been etched into the minds of the Mexica forever, but the prophecy's fulfillment was not a victory lap. It was a death sentence, delivered on a bed of mud and reeds. They had claimed their sacred ground, Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. But what they had truly gained was isolation, vulnerability, and the eternal, demanding gaze of Huitzilopochtli. Every breath they took was in defiance of the natural world. The land was so poor, so waterlogged, that any conventional agriculture was impossible. Their neighbors, the established powers like the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, viewed them not as a burgeoning civilization, but as pathetic, starving refugees squatting on worthless land. This contempt, this calculated cruelty, was the fuel that ignited the true Aztec fire. They were surrounded by enemies, forced to pay back-breaking tribute, and their very existence depended on solving an engineering problem that would make the architects of the pyramids weep with frustration. The swamp was their enemy, but it would soon become their greatest weapon. Survival demanded not just blood, but genius. The Mexica looked at the endless churning waters of Lake Texcoco and saw not a barrier, but infinite possibility. They invented the chinampa, the famed floating garden, a miraculous act of agricultural alchemy that defined their civilization. Imagine taking massive rafts woven from reeds, piling them high with lake mud and decaying vegetation, and anchoring them to the shallow lake bed with willow trees. These were not just fields, they were hyper-fertile, self-watering, floating islands of abundance, producing 7 harvests a year where their rivals struggled for one. This wasn't just farming. This was a total conquest of ecology. While the established empires to the west were constrained by dry seasons and rocky terrain, Tenochtitlan was literally raising its food supply from the depths, multiplying its population at an impossible rate. The speed of their growth was terrifying to their neighbors, built entirely on mud, muscle, and mathematical precision. As the city expanded from mud huts to stable causeways, the time came for true, formal leadership. They needed a Tlatoani, a speaker, a man who could articulate the will of the gods and the ambition of the people. The Tlatoani was not merely a king, he was a living conduit to Huitzilopochtli, ensuring that every political decision was also a divine mandate. But even with their chinampas overflowing, they were slaves. The Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, led by the iron-fisted ruler Tezozomoc, held the leash tightly around Tenochtitlan's neck. They demanded crippling tribute, gold, jade, feathers, and most critically, labor. They forced the Mexica to fight their proxy wars, draining their youth and their spirit. This vassalage was the crucible where the first true Aztec warriors were forged forced to fight and master warfare under the unforgiving eyes of their masters. Every battle fought for Tezazamok was a lesson in strategy, a hidden rehearsal for their own revolution. They learned their enemies' formations, their supply lines, and their weaknesses, all while pretending to be loyal dogs. Decades passed under this crushing servitude, the Mexica biting their tongues and sharpening their obsidian blades in secret. Then, in the year known to history as the early 1400s, the unstoppable force of Tezazamok finally met its match: mortality. The tyrant of Azcapotzalco died, shattering the fragile balance of power across the Valley of Mexico. The people were on the verge of total submission, prepared to flee back into the marshes or offer themselves as willing sacrifices. But in that moment of despair, a new leader rose: Quetzalcoatl, the obsidian serpent. A man whose strategic mind was as sharp as his namesake blade. Quetzalcoatl knew that negotiation was dead. The only path forward was total war, a war they were entirely expected to lose. He rallied the exhausted, terrified warriors with an impossible promise: absolute freedom or glorious annihilation. But he needed allies, and he needed a plan that transcended mere brute force. Quetzalcoatl understood that one small, besieged city could not defeat the military might of Azcapotzalco alone. He reached out to two other aggrieved cities: Texcoco, whose brilliant but exiled prince, Nezahualcoyotl, the fasting coyote, harbored a deep personal vendetta against Maxtla, and Tlacopan. This was the birth of the Xcan Tlatoyoyan, the legendary Triple Alliance. It was a pact sealed not just with political agreements, but with the shared thirst for vengeance against the Tepanec tyranny. They pooled their intelligence, their limited resources, and their boundless fury. The stage was set for the War of Tepanec's Succession, a conflict that would either see the entire Mexica lineage extinguished in the mud, or elevate them to the undisputed rulers of the Mesoamerican world. The Jaguar Knights and the Eagle Warriors, newly christened under the banner of Huitzilopochtli, prepared to march out from the swamp and claim the blood debt they were owed. Their very first step was the impossible siege of the mighty Azcapotzalco itself. Every man knew the stakes. If they failed, their city would be razed, their temples desecrated, and their history forgotten. But if they succeeded, they would inherit an empire, and the debt owed to their war god would be astronomical. The true reign of blood was about to begin. They had seen the sign, the eagle devouring the serpent, high upon the prickly pear. But the sign didn't promise comfort or rest. It promised work, unrelenting and merciless. The chosen land, Tenochtitlan, was not a verdant paradise flowing with milk and honey. It was a festering, mosquito-choked bog, a nightmare of shifting mud and brackish, undrinkable water. This tiny, desolate island was a death trap, constantly threatening to swallow their meager existence whole.
Every piece of heavy stone, every load of precious timber, every single necessity had to be dragged for miles across the mainland, usually paid for with suffocating tribute or the humiliating surrender of their dignity to surrounding city-states.
The first years were a brutal, unending test of Huitzilopochtli's faith. Their beds were thin reed mats laid over sinking earth, their diet meager fish, and the harsh, bitter harvest of the lake's edge. The great power centers of the valley, especially the dominant Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, did not see a burgeoning empire. They saw a doomed collection of desperate savages who would soon collapse back into the mire that birthed them.
They called the Mexica the people of the mud, a derogatory term meant to cement their low status. But the Mexica were forged in necessity, and necessity is the mother of the most terrifying genius, a genius drenched in the grime of the swamp. They looked at the endless, shallow lake not as an obstacle, but as a boundless, malleable resource that could be bent to their will.
This is where the true miracle of Aztec engineering began, the revolutionary construction of the chinampas. Imagine weaving floating islands of hyper-fertile life, gigantic rectangular rafts, anchored not by rope, but by sheer, back-breaking human labor and millions of tons of rich, dredged mud.
They painstakingly layered reeds, mixed decaying vegetation, and fenced the perimeters with saplings that would grow into living willow walls, locking the unbelievably fertile soil permanently into place. These were not mere gardens. They were self-sustaining, perpetually irrigated agricultural platforms, capable of yielding 3, sometimes 4, massive harvests per year.
While their mainland neighbors struggled desperately against seasonal droughts and soil exhaustion, the Mexica were sitting on an endless, self-replenishing food machine, turning the curse of the lake into their single greatest geopolitical advantage. This miraculous caloric surplus would soon be the fuel for their unstoppable military machine.
Yet, even as their floating gardens began to feed thousands, they remained slaves in all but name. Their masters were the iron-fisted Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, ruled by the ancient, cunning, and ruthless Tezozomoc.
Every single improvement, every new causeway they built across the water, every load of valuable obsidian they purchased, required the tacit permission of the Tepanecs, and crucially, required heavy, often ruinous tribute payments. The Mexica became the ultimate mercenary force for Azcapotzalco. Their nascent jaguar and eagle warriors used as disposable shock troops in the endless, brutal proxy wars of the Valley of Mexico.
They paid their rent with gold, with rare trade goods, and most frequently, with their own young men sacrificed on foreign battlefields to fuel the Tepanec war machine. This was the crucible, the ultimate test. They were learning the trade of war, not as commanders, but as tools. They mapped the weaknesses of their enemies, and, most critically, they memorized the soul-crushing arrogance of their oppressors, storing every single slight and humiliation, like dry kindling for a future, inevitable conflagration. Huitzilopochtli, the mighty hummingbird of the South, did not just demand periodic blood sacrifices. He demanded absolute military excellence. Survival meant that every single Mexica male, regardless of his birth into nobility or common status, was fundamentally a soldier first. Their education system was terrifyingly simple, built entirely around the mandate: learn to fight, learn to capture, learn to obey the divine will. The elite training centers, the Calmecac, were not gentle schools of philosophy. They were brutal indoctrination camps for the future ruling class, the sons of nobility destined to become the high priests and the terrifying generals.
Simultaneously, the commoners attended the Tepochcali, where the focus was purely on combat skills, endurance, and the sacred goal of capturing enemy warriors alive for the inevitable ritual debt owed to the gods. The whole society was restructuring itself, transforming with terrifying speed into a single, unified, militarized organism designed solely for relentless expansion and conquest.
Even the intense ritual games served as preparation for the battlefield. The Tlachtli, the ancient Mesoamerican ball game, was played with such fanatical, high-stakes intensity that often the losing captain was immediately sacrificed after the match, a constant, visceral reminder that failure in the world of the Mexica meant total annihilation, both physical and spiritual. The Tepanecs truly believed they had caged the beast. They thought the Mexica were content to remain their attack dogs, their shield, and their endless source of tribute goods. They failed to realize that by forcing the Mexica to fight their wars, they were meticulously training the very army that would one day tear the Tepanec Empire down to its very foundations.
Under the guidance of their early Tlatoani,
Rulers, men like the wise Acamapichli, they played the role of the subservient, loyal vassal for decades, bowing low while secretly stockpiling weapons, building their causeways, and gathering crucial strategic intelligence.
every single coin of tribute they grudgingly handed over was a burning, unforgettable insult. Every humiliating forced march was a military lesson learned the hard way. They were calculating, waiting patiently, measuring the precise moment when the Tepanic sun would finally begin its inevitable, bloody decline, and the true reign of the Aztec Empire would rise from the toxic waters of Lake Texcoco. The cosmic stage was violently set for the impossible, the revolt of the slave state, and the forging of the world-changing Triple Alliance. The debt owed to the gods was about to be paid, not in small periodic offerings, but in an earth-shattering tidal wave of enemy hearts.
The fulfillment of the prophecy was not the end of suffering. It was merely the grand, catastrophic prelude to an impossible construction project.
The Mexica stood on a patch of mire, a mud-soaked island in the middle of a saline lake, surrounded by enemies who mocked their desperate, sinking foundation. Every stone laid was a battle against the treacherous, unstable earth. Every sunrise a challenge to the very physics of existence. Yet the city of Tenochtitlan began to rise, block by agonizing block.
They had claimed the island as mandated by the feathered serpent and the war god. But how does a burgeoning population feed itself when its entire landmass is unstable muck? The Mexica did not despair over the lack of fertile ground. They became master engineers who simply decided to create it. They wove massive baskets, dredged the nutrient-rich sludge from the lakebed, and built vast rectangular rafts of soil anchored by willow trees, the legendary chinampas, or floating gardens.
These were not just farms. They were a radical declaration of dominance over nature, utilizing a technological genius that allowed them to harvest crops 4 times a year. This impossible abundance fueled their growing population and, more importantly, fed their impossible ambition, transforming a cursed swamp into a breadbasket that astonished their established neighbors. But while their city rose, their status remained perilously low. The mighty Mexica, the chosen people of the sun god, were shackled vassals, paying crippling tribute to the colossal power that had dominated the Valley of Mexico for over a century. The Aztec Empire ruled from the city of Azcapotzalco. Their ancient, terrifying ruler, Tezozamoc, held the Mexica leaders, the Tlatoni, on a tight, humiliating leash, demanding not just gold, grain, and labor, but constant military service as mere shock troops for his own dynastic wars. This enforced slavery, this constant humiliation, proved to be the dark, necessary forge of the Aztec war machine. Forced to fight constantly for their typanic masters, the Mexica armies honed their unique, brutal strategies. They learned the topography of the entire valley, cataloged the political weaknesses of every major city-state, and perfected the ritualistic capture of prisoners needed to satisfy the growing, bloodthirsty demands of Huitzilopochtli. They were not merely fighting for Azcapotzalco. They were gathering intelligence and operational readiness, waiting for the one perfect moment to strike at the very hand that fed them, to deliver the ultimate betrayal. For decades, the Tepanec iron grip never faltered, thanks to the sheer longevity and cunning of Tezozamoc. He was the undisputed master manipulator of the region, and every aspiring city existed only by his cruel, transactional permission. The pressure on Tenochtitlan was unbearable. If they failed to pay tribute, Azcapotzalco would instantly flood their island, destroy their meticulously built chinampas, and massacre their populace. Every year was a terrifying calculation of compliance versus preparation. But deep within the stone halls, the Mexica Tlatoni, Itzcoatl, watched and learned, internalizing the indignity of their position. The colossal empire he had built, held together solely by the terrifying, unifying force of his personality, instantly fragmented into a chaos of political rivalries. Two sons, Moxla and Tayao, immediately began a vicious, fratricidal war for the Tepanek throne, plunging the previously secure valley into a state of lethal uncertainty.
This was the sign Itzcoatl had waited for, the precise alignment of instability and weakness that could be exploited. The moment demanded a move so audacious it bordered on suicidal. Moxla, the son who eventually seized power in Azcapotzalco, viewed the upstart Mexica with utter contempt and promptly increased their tribute demands to impossible, crippling levels. This was a deliberate provocation meant to crush Tenochtitlan into dust, a final test of obedience. The choice for the Mexica was now stark: passive execution and the complete obliteration of their destiny, or armed, glorious self-determination. Itzcoatl, guided by the cold, tactical brilliance of his chief advisor, Flacaeu, chose immediate, total war.
But Tenochtitlan could not stand alone against the massive, entrenched armies of the full Tepanek Empire, even one weakened by internal strife. They needed allies, and Tlacaelel knew exactly where to find them: in the rival city-state of Texcoco, where the rightful heir, Nezahualcoyotl, the great poet-king, driven into exile by Tezozomoc years earlier, was desperately seeking the means for his own bloody revenge. This was the geopolitical chess game that would reshape the continent forever. The Mexica offered their unparalleled, disciplined military force. Nezahualcoyotl offered his genius as a strategist, a diplomat, and an engineer. They were the perfect, terrifying complement to one another. The final cataclysmic showdown with Azcapotzalco was now inevitable, a battle that would determine not just who ruled the valley, but which god had the superior, insatiable hunger for the human heart.
The island city of Tenochtitlan was holding its breath, a tiny, fragile raft of mud and stone floating in a vast, hostile sea of Tepanek power. The ultimatum had been delivered not by diplomatic envoy, but by the relentless, suffocating shadow of their overlords in Azcapotzalco. The reign of the ancient tyrant Tezozomoc, the living embodiment of Tepanek dominance, had cast a cruel, exacting net over the entire Valley of Mexico for nearly a century, and the Mexica had suffered under its weight, paying tribute in blood and sweat.
They were required to pay crippling taxes, vast quantities of fish, birds, textiles, and, most crucially, the labor to build the very causeways and monuments that cemented the Tepanek humiliation of the entire region. The Mexica knew that challenging the great city of Azcapotzalco was not simply a military action. It was an act of existential defiance against an empire that considered them little more than swamp-dwelling insects who had forgotten their place. Every knife sharpened, every obsidian edge meticulously prepared,
was a prayer to Huitzilopochtli, a desperate plea for the strength to survive the annihilation that was surely coming if they failed. The tension was a palpable, living thing, tightening its grip around the reed huts and massive temples of Tenochtitlan as the years bled into the inevitable confrontation. Then the impossible happened. Tezozomok, the seemingly immortal Tepanec king, finally died in 1426, plunging the dominant kingdom into immediate, chaotic crisis. A power vacuum is a dangerous thing, but in the hands of the ambitious and the desperate, it is the greatest gift the gods can bestow.
Maxtla looked upon the Mexica, these ambitious upstarts who had dared to build a glittering city where only marsh had existed, and saw not subjects, but a dangerous, smoldering threat that needed to be extinguished immediately, thoroughly, and publicly. He immediately ramped up the tribute demands to impossible levels, a clear signal that he intended to bleed the island city dry until its people either starved or rose up in a pathetic, easily crushed rebellion. He was trying to provoke a fight, confident that the sheer weight of Tepanec numbers would drown the Mexica in the lake. But the Mexica had a new strategic leader, the fourth Tlatoani, Itzcoatl, the obsidian serpent, a man of immense political savvy and terrifying religious conviction. Itzcoatl understood that Maxtla's instability was their only chance, that the time for bowing and scraping was over, replaced by the grim necessity of total war. He looked upon his people, surrounded, starving, and terrified, and made a pact so radical, so terrifying, that it silenced the elders who still preached caution. They would fight for absolute victory or accept absolute annihilation. If they lost, every Mexica citizen would pledge themselves to eternal, unconditional servitude, becoming slave labor for the Tepanecs forever. But Itzcoatl, the master strategist, knew that sheer will alone could not defeat the Tepanec legions. He needed allies, and his eyes turned immediately to the rival city-state of Texcoco, which had suffered its own catastrophe years earlier at the hands of Tezozomok. The deposed prince of Texcoco, Nezahualcoyotl, the fasting coyote, was hiding in the surrounding hills, a military and engineering genius, burning with a cold, righteous fury and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance for the murder of his father. Itzcoatl sought him out, traversing dangerous, enemy-patrolled territory for a secret meeting that would change the course of Mesoamerican history forever. The two leaders, one the architect of a new island empire, and the other the rightful king of an ancient realm, forged an alliance built on shared hatred and mutual ambition. They were joined by Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanec city, disgusted by Maxtla's tyranny, thus establishing the cornerstone of the legendary Excan-Tlatoloyan, the Triple Alliance, the engine of the future Aztec Empire. This political move was a masterful stroke, instantly doubling their effective fighting force and providing critical flanking maneuvers across the lake.
Moxtla, finally realizing the existential threat posed by this unexpected coalition, acted decisively. He ordered the immediate cutting of the main aqueduct supplying fresh water to Tenochtitlan.
The choking siege had begun, designed to break the will of the city through thirst and disease before the massive Teutonic army even had to march. The Mexica found their already meager fresh water turning brackish and poisonous, forcing them to rely on the dangerous, difficult art of canoeing water in from distant, uncontaminated springs.
In the year 1428, Quetzalcoatl gave the final, irreversible command. The Mexica armies, bolstered by the disciplined forces of Nezahualcóyotl, erupted from the causeways like a tidal wave of obsidian fury.
They marched directly on the Tepanec strongholds of Coyoacán, and then aimed for the heart, Azcapotzalco itself. The initial battles were characterized by the sheer desperation and suicidal bravery of the Mexica warriors, fueled by the knowledge that retreat meant slavery.
They had built their destiny on a patch of cursed saline mud, the prophecy fulfilled, but the real struggle only just beginning. Tenochtitlan was a brilliant beacon of defiance, but it was also a city teetering on the edge of permanent starvation, hemmed in by the vengeful waters of Lake Texcoco and the hostile armies that ringed the shore. Every single sunrise brought the existential threat of a deluge that could wipe their flimsy reed and mud dwellings clean off the map, returning them to the primordial ooze from which they had so brutally emerged.
The enemy wasn't just the Tepanec or the Acolwa. The true enemy was the unforgiving, treacherous lake itself, a fickle god that demanded constant sacrifice, threatening to swallow their entire civilization whole the moment their attention wavered. The priests demanded blood to appease Huitzilopochtli, but the engineers demanded mud, massive stones, and the collective unyielding labor of every single man, woman, and child, transforming desperation into design.
They were landless, surrounded by water that was too salty to drink and too prone to flooding to farm. Yet they were forced by their own terrifying ambition to feed an ever-growing population dedicated solely to war and expansion. Survival depended not on brute force, but on an unprecedented, almost unbelievable act of hydraulic genius that would change the face of the entire Mesoamerican world forever. What happened next was not just engineering. It was a miraculous declaration of war against the very concept of scarcity. The Mexica looked at the endless, choking swamp, and instead of lamenting the lack of earth, they decided to literally create their own land, pulling fertile soil out of the depths of the abyss. They invented the Chinampa system, the legendary floating gardens that defied all natural law, turning the very water that threatened to drown them into their greatest resource. These weren't just small patches of dirt thrown haphazardly into the marsh. These were massive, interwoven grids of reed baskets filled with dredged lake muck,
decomposing vegetation and rich, life-giving silt, secured by planting fast-growing willow trees along the edges to anchor them to the lake floor. They were farming plots born of pure, distilled labor, providing multiple harvests a year, a sustainable agricultural engine so efficient it allowed a small, isolated island city to rapidly outpace the food production of sprawling mainland empires. The Chinampas were the engine room of the Aztec war machine, fueling an explosion of demographic growth that created a self-sustaining metropolis where thousands thrived.
But to connect this island fortress to the outside world, to import the necessary timber and basalt rock that the swamp utterly lacked, they needed impossible bridges of stone across kilometers of open water. This demand initiated the second great cataclysmic engineering project, the construction of the Great Causeways.
They began the Herculean task of building monolithic, elevated earthen roadways lined with stone walls, stretching like stony arteries across the vast, dark expanse of the lake. The causeways of Tepeyac, Iztapalapa, Tlacopan, and Coyoacan weren't just roads. They were strategic military highways, vital trade arteries, and sophisticated aqueducts, channeling fresh spring water from the mainland hills directly into the heart of the city through ingenious gravity-fed systems. The logistical challenges were mind-bending, requiring astronomical levels of organization and the mobilization of a workforce that dwarfed anything their neighbors could muster. They needed precise mathematical knowledge to manage the subtle yet lethal differences in water level, a constant threat that could swamp the entire system in a single, unforgiving storm. And then came the ultimate, recurring catastrophe: the floods. Lake Texcoco, being a closed geological basin, was prone to devastating cyclical overflows, especially when the mountain runoff was extreme, bringing the cold wrath of Tlaloc down upon their fragile city. Salty water would mix with the fresh, instantly destroying delicate chinampa crops and sickening the teeming population.
The existential threat was so severe, it demanded a radical, absolutely unprecedented solution. They had to partition the lake itself, severing the deep waters from their residential zone. This brings us to the rise of one of the great, if often overshadowed, political and architectural geniuses of this era, the magnificent philosopher king, Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco, a temporary ally and powerful rival who possessed the engineering intellect to rival the gods themselves. Together, the Mexica and their partners undertook the construction of the Great Dike of Nezahualcóyotl, an almost 15-kilometer-long barrier of massive stone, earth, and wood, stretching relentlessly across the middle of the lake. It was a construction project that demanded years of backbreaking labor and resources from every single tributary city they could leverage.
This dike was a monstrous undertaking, designed not just to stop the floods physically, but to strategically divide the salty, highly corrosive eastern half of Texcoco from the fresh western half surrounding Tenochtitlan, ensuring their aqueducts drew only potable water and protecting the delicate Chinampa ecosystem from saline contamination that would have instantly annihilated their food supply. This massive investment in infrastructure, this forced mastery over the terrifying forces of nature, signaled the definitive transition from desperate, mud-smeared refugees to regional masters. They had militarized their environment, turning the treacherous, defensive lake into an impenetrable moat, protected by causeways that could be defended by a handful of elite warriors against an entire army. Tenochtitlan became a logistical nightmare for any potential attacker, an urban fortress fed by its own constantly regenerating floating gardens, making it utterly impossible to besiege effectively and starve into submission. The Mexica had not just built a city, they had forged a weapon, a hydrostatic engine of conquest fueled by fresh water, endless harvests, and the sheer, terrifying ambition that only a people who had wrestled their destiny from the jaws of a serpent and an eagle could possess. The stage was irrevocably set. They were no longer vassals paying tribute to the Tepanecs. They were the awe-inspiring architects of the largest, most sophisticated urban center the continent had ever seen, commanding an unparalleled logistical base. Their sights were now firmly fixed on rewriting the political map of the Valley of Mexico, and they intended to do it through fire, tribute, and the unyielding strength of their stone and water control.
The vast, watery graveyard, where the greatest empires the valley had known had slowly drowned, had been transformed into the fertile, fortified cradle of the ultimate superpower, its dominance exploding under the unforgiving weight of the Mexica's religiously mandated rage, now backed by the sheer, unyielding physics of engineering genius.
The prophecy was fulfilled. The eagle had devoured the serpent, and the island of mud, reeds, and divine filth had been christened Tenochtitlan, the impossible city. But the nightmare was just beginning. Building a metropolis on a foundation of shifting, brackish swamp and divine promise required more than just stone and sacrifice. It required an organizational structure so rigid, so ruthless, so utterly devoted to the war god Huitzilopochtli, that it could tame the very physics of its environment. The Mexica faced a logistical impossibility. They were surrounded by enemies, isolated on water, and sitting on a sinking sponge of sediment. How could they feed the hundreds, soon thousands, pouring into this death trap, drawn by the terrifying magnetic pull of their fulfillment? The answer was an engineering miracle, a defiant act of agronomic warfare against the lake itself, the Chinampa system. They weren't just farming. They were creating solid, fertile land where no land existed. They wove massive nets of reeds and willow stakes, dredged the nutrient-rich sediment from the lake bottom, and layered these materials into miniature, rectangular islands of hyper-productive soil, anchoring them deep into the mire. These floating gardens were the logistical engine of empire, producing up to 7 harvests a year, maize, beans, squash, chile, an agricultural surplus unheard of in the region. This constant, overwhelming food supply fed the commoners, kept the populace compliant, and most critically, sustained the relentless military machine.
The city's survival depended on this engineered stability, but its expansion demanded absolute, crushing order. Mexica society was not a fluid structure. It was a military caste system forged in the crucible of constant existential threat. A pyramid built on layers of terrifying compliance.
At the apex sat the Tlatoani, the speaker, the living voice of the gods, and the ultimate intermediary between the temporal world and the cosmic furnace. His authority was paralyzing, his word the physical law of the land, because his success determined whether the sun would rise again tomorrow.
Beneath this divine monarch, the populace was meticulously segregated into the Kalpuli, the great neighborhood wards. These were not just residential zones. They were highly structured, militarized units, responsible for taxation, religious ceremonies, conscription, and the grueling, back-breaking public works projects that kept Tenochtitlan from sliding back into the primordial ooze.
Every single citizen had a purpose, defined not by comfort or individual happiness, but by their contribution to the relentless, bloody expansion of the sun god's territory. There was no room for idleness, no tolerance for weakness. The penalty for dereliction of duty often meant the ultimate sacrifice.
They were taught that the purpose of life was the capture of sacrificial victims, the flowery war, a grim, beautiful euphemism for the endless military expeditions that defined their existence and maintained the cosmic balance.
Failure in battle, or worse, retreating with cowardice, was the deepest spiritual dishonor, often resulting in swift public execution by the state that demanded perfection. Huitzilopochtli demanded the vital, beating essence of captured warriors, and the entire socio-economic framework of the state was structured entirely around fulfilling this horrifying astronomical debt.
They paid crushing tribute, goods, labor, and most humiliatingly, their most feared and skilled warriors to fight other people's wars. This forced subservience, this constant humiliation, was a spiritual poison that fueled the Mexica's silent, simmering hatred and solidified their resolve. This period of vassalage, this bitter humiliation under the Tepaneck shadow, was the crucible that forged the ultimate Aztec military mindset, a blend of strategic genius derived from enforced servitude and an explosive, religiously mandated fury. They were waiting, planning, building the infrastructure of their own dominance under the very noses of their unsuspecting overlords. They mastered the geography, learned the weaknesses of their neighbors, and stockpiled the silent rage of a warrior people denied their ultimate, divine destiny.
The viper had coiled long enough.
For generations, the Mexica had paid their blood taxes, submitting to the iron fist of Azcapotzalco, the dominant Teponic power that controlled the western shore of Lake Texcoco. They were seen as useful, expendable mercenaries, their war canoes the sharp edge of the Teponic blade. Yet they were planning the perfect internal strike. But a mercenary who knows the secrets of the master's fort eventually turns the key, and the year 1428 AD became the ignition point for an inferno that would remake the world.
The Tlatoani of Azcapotzalco, Maxtla, a man whose arrogance was exceeded only by his short-sightedness, decided it was time to crush the upstart islanders once and for all, eliminating his most dangerous asset before it became his doom. He moved against Tenochtitlan, believing the island state was still weak, forgetting that necessity is the mother of Mexica invention, and that their engineering genius was merely the handmaiden of their bloodlust.
The odds were impossible, stacked against them like sacrificial firewood. The Mexica were besieged, facing starvation and the overwhelming might of the Tepanec armies who controlled the mainland supply lines. This was the moment of Huitzilopochtmi's greatest demand: absolute, unflinching commitment. The new Tlatoani, the legendary Itzcoatl, stood upon the Great Pyramid and swore an oath that wasn't just political, but utterly apocalyptic, daring destiny to deny them. If they failed, the Mexica would abandon their god, their city, and their name, sinking into historical oblivion as mere slaves forever. But if they succeeded, their conquest would be total, their dominance eternal. This dramatic declaration galvanized the people. They were fighting not just for their lives, but for the very existence of their divine mission, driven by a fear far greater than death itself. This was no gentle alliance. It was a military contract written in future tribute and shared spoils, a non-aggression pact between future titans. They brought Tlacopan, a smaller but strategically important city, into the fold. The stage was set for the creation of the Triple Alliance: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, three heads sharing one monstrous body, designed for the sole purpose of perpetual, profitable, and religiously mandated war. The War of Liberation was swift and brutally efficient. Maxtla was hunted down, his capital of Azcapotzalco utterly destroyed, its lands distributed as spoils to the victors. The Tepanic era was violently over, replaced by the terrifying dawn of the Aztec Empire. This wasn't just a victory. It was the institutionalization of conquest, the creation of the machinery that would churn out empire for the next century. The Triple Alliance immediately divided the spoils of war and the tribute demands. But more importantly, it codified the rules of engagement for all future conflicts. Warfare became not just defensive, but mandatory and expansionary, driven by the ceaseless hunger of the sun god. Their reach extended far beyond the valley, demanding cotton, jade, feathers, gold, and, most critically, human hearts, from populations hundreds of miles away, turning neighboring cities into mandatory farm systems for resources. But an empire requires arteries to function. How do you govern a sprawling territory, maintaining absolute control from a swampy island? The answer lay in a feat of engineering so audacious it remains breathtaking even today, defying the limitations of their technology. They built causeways, massive earthen and stone roads, often 25 feet wide and reinforced with timber, spanning the 5 miles across the treacherous muddy lagoon, connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland cities of Tlacopan, Tepeyac, and Iztapalapa.
These were not just roads, they were lifelines, military highways that allowed the rapid movement of troops and the ceaseless, organized flow of tribute goods into the island capital, acting as giant economic veins pumping wealth inward. Yet, the lake held a constant, deadly threat. The massive, beautiful but fragile city was built in the western, salty zone of Lake Texcoco, which was chronically prone to catastrophic flooding from the freshwater rivers feeding it from the eastern mountains.
A single, unchecked flood could wipe out the entire civilization, dissolving their mud and reed foundations into watery graves. The solution, spearheaded by the genius of Nezahualcóyotl, the Texcocan engineer king, was the construction of the Great Dike of Nezahualcóyotl, a gigantic 11-mile-long stone and earth barrier that segmented the lake into 2 distinct hydraulic basins.
This monumental wall, built by tens of thousands of dedicated laborers using basket loads of earth and stone, protected the city from the dangerous high water surges of the east and carefully managed the salinity levels necessary for their unique Chinampa agriculture. It was an environmental manipulation on an unthinkable scale, a testament to the Mexica's fierce belief that nature itself must bend to the strategic will of Huitzilopochtli, the divine engineer.
While the Alliance conquered the physical world, they had to conquer the logistic world as well. The very drinking water was a critical problem. The lake was saline, undrinkable, and disease-ridden. So they built another marvel, the revolutionary twin-pipe aqueduct of Chapultepec. This system brought fresh spring water from the mainland mountains directly into the heart of the city through massive ceramic and stone pipes laid across the causeways, a constant source of life in a hostile environment.
Crucially, the system had twin pipes. While one pipe was in continuous use, delivering the city's daily supply, the other could be immediately shut down for maintenance and detailed cleaning, ensuring an uninterrupted supply of pure water, a logistical luxury unmatched by any other city in the entire Mesoamerican world, a sign of their advanced urbanism. Tenochtitlan was becoming a truly unique urban center, a Venice of the New World, protected by impossible engineering and powered by the relentless demand for war and tribute.
Every single canoe that sliced through the lake's water, every load of maize harvested from the floating gardens, every jade pendant that arrived from the distant Gulf Coast was a direct consequence of the Triple Alliance's military hegemony, a clear receipt of their dominance. They had engineered a perpetual motion machine of conquest, where the tribute funded the army, and the army ruthlessly enforced the tribute,
creating a self-sustaining cycle of violence and wealth.
But the success brought a terrifying consequence. The hunger of the war god was never, ever sated. The scope of their empire now meant that warfare was not just strategic or political, it was profoundly liturgical. They needed captives, thousands upon thousands of them, to feed the solar disk, ensuring the sun would violently rise another day. This escalating mandatory violence, necessary for their spiritual survival, would eventually sow the seeds of the very destruction that lay dormant in the West, waiting silently for its terrible cue.
The Mexica had traded subservience to Azcapotzalco for a far heavier subservience to their own terrible destiny. They were the undisputed masters of the valley, yes, but they were also the slaves of a cosmic clock, counting down to an inevitable, bloody reckoning that their own ambition had set in motion.